I have to admit, when I first got the materials for today's deep dive, I actually had to sit back and just take a breath.
Yeah, it is a truly sobering set of sources.
Because, if you casually scroll through the news right now or catch a 5-second clip on social media, you might think we are looking at just another standard geopolitical flare-up in the Middle East. Some missiles fly, some statements are made, the market gets the jitters, and then things go back to a tense normal.
Right, the usual cycle.
Exactly. But the sources we are unpacking today are arguing something entirely different and, frankly, completely apocalyptic. We are diving into two incredibly dense, highly charged interviews from the Judging Freedom channel. Both are dated February 28th, 2026. They feature veteran military and intelligence analysts Larry Johnson and Scott Ritter.
And their core thesis is not for the faint of heart.
No, it's not. They argue we aren't just looking at a skirmish. We are looking at a catastrophic, unfolding United States and Israeli military strike against Iran that is, as we speak, fundamentally fracturing global stability.
And before we get into the weeds of naval logistics and missile capacities, I really want to make something crystal clear for you, the listener. The claims in these transcripts regarding the current U.S. administration, the Israeli government, the Iranian leadership, and this broader global conflict are intense.
They're extremely intense.
They are highly polarizing. Our job today is not to take a side. We are not here to tell you who the good guys or bad guys are or validate any political rhetoric.
We are just looking at the analysis.
Exactly, because we are living in an era where the fog of war is thicker than it has ever been in human history. We have to acknowledge the reality the sources are framing here. They are operating on the premise that World War III has effectively already begun.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It is, but their context is that the West has already been in a fierce, grinding proxy war with Russia for the last 4 years. We are currently standing on the absolute brink of nuclear catastrophe, and we are navigating all of this in an environment of near-total censorship and information warfare.
Right, the propaganda machine is in overdrive.
Total overdrive. Artificial intelligence has reached a level where distinguishing truth from falsehood is practically impossible. Every piece of news, even high-definition visual evidence, can be manipulated and falsified to push false narratives from all sides.
So you can have a flawlessly rendered video of an event that just never happened.
Precisely, pushed by state actors to drive a narrative. So our mission today is strictly to strip away that noise. We want to deeply analyze the background and credibility of Larry Johnson and Scott Ritter based on their actual experience and consequently analyze their specific critiques of this U.S. and Israeli attack on Iran and what it means geopolitically. We want to give you the raw arguments so you can weigh the reality for yourselves.
And that reality, according to Johnson and Ritter, is grim. They aren't just predicting future trouble, they're stating that the disaster is already here.
The disaster is actively unfolding.
Yeah. The hook of these interviews is that this current military action is essentially a failing decapitation strike. They are detailing a hidden catastrophic ammunition crisis within the U.S. military that nobody in the mainstream is talking about.
A literal lack of bullets.
Right. Plus the functional closure of the Strait of Hormuz to Western shipping and explicit warnings that this specific conflict is actively dragging us into a multipolar nuclear standoff involving Russia, China, and North Korea.
It is a massive web of interlocking crises.
So to even begin to understand how they get to that terrifying conclusion, we have to start with the tactical picture. What actually happened in the opening hours of this strike?
According to the timeline detailed in the source material, the United States and Israel launched a joint, highly coordinated attack. But the crucial piece of context here is the objective.
It wasn't just a warning shot.
No, this wasn't framed by the analysts as a limited punitive action or the targeted strike on a specific weapons facility just to send a message. The ultimate goal of this operation was outright regime change in Iran.
Which is a massive escalation.
The initial salvo is described as involving 50 cruise missiles, targeting 30 specific high-value sites primarily concentrated in Tehran. But Scott Ritter hones in on the true gravity of this attack. It was specifically designed to assassinate the supreme political and religious leadership of the country.
They were hunting the top guys.
They were actively hunting President Pezeshkian and, more importantly, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
I really want to pause on that because I think a lot of Western listeners might hear the word Ayatollah and just think of a standard head of state or a rogue political opponent.
A guy in a suit giving a speech.
Exactly. But Ritter emphasizes just how unprecedented that specific targeting is, right? He makes a comparison that really stuck with me. He argues that trying to kill the Ayatollah is akin to attempting to assassinate the Pope.
Or the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Right, or the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. This isn't just a politician. He is the second most revered figure in all of Shia Islam. The psychological and cultural magnitude of trying to vaporize that level of religious leadership is staggering. It completely rewrites the rules of engagement.
It entirely shatters them.
Yeah.
And what makes this tactical decision so pivotal for the rest of the analysis is the absolute failure of that decapitation attempt.
They missed.
Both analysts report that this high-stakes assassination strike missed its primary marks. The supreme leader survived. The president survived. The upper echelon of the political and military leadership largely remained intact, save for a few localized commanders.
Which is the worst possible outcome if you're the one launching the strike.
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario. Because it failed, the sources argue that the U.S. and Israel have effectively opened Pandora's box without neutralizing the threat they set out to eliminate. You don't get to attempt to assassinate the equivalent of the Pope, miss, and then expect things to go back to standard diplomatic posturing.
But wait, I have to ask, how do they miss? If you have the combined intelligence apparatus of the United States and Israel, and you launch a coordinated strike on 30 sites in the capital, how does the entire senior leadership just slip through the net?
Larry Johnson addresses that directly in his interview. He notes that the Iranians had been aware of this impending attack for over 2 months.
2 months? That's an eternity in military planning.
It really is. This wasn't a surprise midnight raid that caught them sleeping. They had been actively preparing for it. They had established clear, decentralized lines of succession. They fortified their command and control bunkers. They ensured that the military structure would remain functional, even if the capital was turned to rubble.
So the intelligence element of surprise was just completely absent.
Completely. And because Iran knew it was coming, and because their leadership survived, their response wasn't disorganized, it was immediate.
And this is where Johnson and Ritter draw a massive, terrifying contrast with previous conflicts in the region. If you think back to the June 2025 conflict, Johnson points out that during that exchange, Iran confined its retaliatory strikes entirely to Israeli targets.
Mostly economic and military installations.
Right. It was considered a contained, somewhat proportional response. But this time, within an hour and a half of the initial U.S. and Israeli attack, Iran was firing back. And they weren't just aiming at Tel Aviv.
No, they broadened the scope immediately.
They began directly targeting United States bases and military installations throughout the Persian Gulf and stretching all the way into Iraq.
The scale and the speed of that retaliation are what the analysts find so alarming. Let's look at the numbers Ritter provides regarding the initial counterattack. He notes that Iran fired a first wave of 127 ballistic missiles toward Israel.
That's a massive barrage.
But here is the critical, almost counterintuitive detail that Ritter zeroes in on. He claims these were older tech missiles. These were not Iran's bleeding-edge hypersonic weapons.
They were just clearing the shelves.
Essentially, yes. They were older stock used to clear the board and test the defenses. And yet, out of those 127 older missiles, 33 of them still managed to completely bypass the highly touted Western air defense networks and strike their targets.
Wow. That feels like a very crucial data point, because if I'm doing the math, that's roughly a 25% penetration rate against what we are constantly told are the most advanced, impenetrable air defense shields on the planet. Systems like the Patriot batteries and the Iron Dome.
Precisely. And the insight here is that modern high-tech defense is economically and mathematically vulnerable to sheer volume. If a quarter of your opponent's oldest technology is getting through, it raises severe existential questions about what happens when Iran decides to unveil its most advanced modern ballistic missiles.
Stuff they're holding back.
Right. The sources claim these top-tier weapons are still being held in reserve in massive, hardened underground facilities known as missile cities. The analysts suggest Iran is pacing itself, letting the West burn through its defensive interceptors on cheap targets.
And we aren't just talking about abstract dots on a radar screen here. Johnson brings us down to a specific illustrative reality that paints a really dark picture of the immediate blowback. He highlights a direct, successful attack on the U.S. Fifth Fleet facility in Bahrain.
Which is a huge deal.
Huge. For context, for those who might not know, the Fifth Fleet is the nerve center for U.S. naval operations in the Middle East. It's a massive, crucial port. It houses thousands of American naval personnel and officers.
It is the anchor of American power projection there.
And according to the transcript, that specific facility was successfully hit by Iranian missiles and was reportedly on fire. But Johnson adds a layer of psychological complexity to this that I found really chilling. He claims that local Bahrainis, the civilian population of the host country, were actually in the streets cheering as the Iranian missiles slammed into the American naval facility.
That civilian reaction is a critical piece of the geopolitical puzzle. It demonstrates the incredibly fragile nature of the U.S. presence in the region. The analysts are arguing that the era of uncontested American staging grounds is just over.
You can't just park there anymore.
No. The United States cannot simply park multi-billion-dollar military assets in sovereign Arab nations, launch offensive, regime change strikes from them, and then expect those bases to remain off-limits to retaliation. The host countries are no longer a shield.
Actually, it's the opposite now.
Right. According to the sources, Iran has explicitly communicated that any nation hosting U.S. radars, air bases, or naval facilities involved in this attack is viewed as actively complicit. Therefore, their territory is a legitimate, legal, military target.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and visualize the scale of what we were talking about here. If you thought the conflicts of the 90s, the 2000s, or even the targeted strikes of the last few years were chaotic, this is something else entirely. The picture painted by Johnson and Ritter suggests a total, uncontained regional ignition.
A complete breakdown of the old order.
We're talking about a scenario where the standard, unspoken rules of engagement, where U.S. bases were generally considered a red line, have completely evaporated within the span of roughly 12 hours.
And when you hear claims of that magnitude, that the entire architecture of Middle Eastern deterrence has collapsed in a single day, it naturally demands a rigorous assessment of the people making those claims.
Why should we trust these guys?
Exactly. Why should we listen to Larry Johnson and Scott Ritter? What makes their specific critiques of this U.S. and Israeli military action credible? To truly evaluate the terrifying scenarios they're outlining, we must deeply analyze their professional backgrounds because their experience directly informs the unique lenses through which they view this conflict.
Let's start with Scott Ritter. I think a lot of listeners might hear his intense, furious critique of the American air campaign and wonder where that visceral anger is coming from. He isn't just an armchair geopolitical podcaster.
Far from it.
He brings a highly specific, deeply technical background in military targeting, specifically from his time serving as an intelligence officer during the 1991 Gulf War, Desert Storm. He was the guy in the room identifying targets, analyzing raw intelligence, and directing the application of massive air power.
That background is the absolute foundation for his current analysis. Ritter is looking at the 2026 strike on Iran through the highly technical, often brutal realities of identifying what is a legitimate military target and what is a tragic mistake.
And he shares a story to illustrate that, right?
He does. In the source material, to explain his standard for military professionalism, he shares a deeply traumatizing, deeply personal anecdote from his time in the Gulf War. It serves as the moral anchor for his entire critique.
The hunt for Scuds.
Yes. He details his intimate involvement in the desperate mission to find and destroy Iraqi Scud missile launchers before they could strike Israel and drag them into the broader coalition war.
The pressure on that mission was immense. If Israel got hit and retaliated, the whole Arab coalition fighting Saddam Hussein might have fractured. So Ritter's team is hunting these mobile launchers around the clock, and he explains how the intelligence led them to a specific facility in Baghdad known as the Amiria Shelter.
It is a really heavy story, but it is crucial for understanding his point. Ritter explains that they hadn't just guessed. They had intercepted a highly specific encrypted radio signal. He even names it.
The Siemens Mark 14.
The Siemens Mark 14 radio telephone signature. According to their intelligence profiles, this specific encrypted signal was firmly believed to be used exclusively by Saddam Hussein and his inner circle for the senior command and control of the Scud missiles.
And that signal was coming from the shelter.
That distinct signal was emanating directly from the antennas associated with the Amiria facility. The detail regarding the Siemens Mark 14 signal is vital here. It shows that they were operating on what they believed was hard, irrefutable signals intelligence, or SIGINT.
They weren't just dropping bombs blindly.
Right. Ritter explicitly states in the interview that they reviewed this intelligence repeatedly. They looked at satellite imagery, they looked at the electronic intercepts, and they saw absolutely no indication that this hardened bunker was being used as a civilian bomb shelter at that specific time.
So based on that data, they made the call.
Operating on that data, Ritter personally helped select the impact points on the structure, and he signed off on the strike. The mission utilized two GBU-28 bunker buster bombs.
And for context, a GBU-28 is a massive 5,000-pound laser-guided bomb designed specifically to penetrate deep underground through heavily reinforced concrete before detonating. It is a devastating weapon.
And the outcome of that strike is what haunts him to this day, and he is brutally honest about it. When the dust settled, the reality on the ground was broadcast on CNN for the entire world to see. It turned out the facility was indeed being used as a civilian bomb shelter.
Oh, man.
The strike resulted in the horrific deaths of 408 women and children. Ritter doesn't sanitize it. He describes the brutal physics of those bunker-buster bombs in a confined space. The sheer heat of the fire, the internal water pipes bursting and boiling, effectively turning the victims' bodies into fat. It is a gruesome, devastating memory that he admits haunts him every single day of his life.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. I hear that story, and it is undeniably tragic. But looking at Ritter's background, he's looking at this current war through the lens of a massive personal intelligence failure from 35 years ago. Is it fair for him to assume that the U.S. and Israel are making the same mistakes in 2026? I mean, isn't it possible he's just projecting his own trauma onto this new conflict?
It is a completely fair question, and Ritter anticipates that counterargument. He uses this immense trauma, not to say that all bombing is inherently bad, but to establish a rigid baseline for military professionalism and the gravity of targeting errors.
He's setting a standard.
He is. He argues that even when his team made that catastrophic mistake at Amiria in 1991, they had done their absolute best, using the most rigorous processes available to ensure it was a legitimate military target based on hard signals intelligence. They were actively trying to be precise.
And he doesn't think that's happening now.
Exactly. He contrasts that painstaking, albeit flawed, process with what he claims is happening in the skies over Iran right now.
Right, because he points out that in the opening hours of this new 2026 campaign, the U.S. and Israel bombed 2 girls' schools, resulting in the deaths of somewhere between 63 and 105 children. For Ritter, with his background in the agonizing, microscopic work of targeting, this is not a simple fog of war accident.
Not at all.
He argues vehemently that if you have modern optics, modern AI-assisted targeting, and you are following proper military doctrine, you do not accidentally drop munitions on 2 separate schools.
And Ritter's professional diagnosis of why those schools were bombed is chilling, and it has nothing to do with the bad intelligence. It has to do with the bad doctrine.
What does he mean by bad doctrine?
He hypothesizes that these civilian strikes are the direct result of artificial, politically mandated metrics. The military, he suggests, has been ordered from the top down to sustain a high-intensity 4-day air campaign. But they lack the proper intelligence on the ground, or perhaps they lack the specific precision munitions required to continually hit legitimate, hardened military targets.
So they just have to hit something. Anything.
That is the logical conclusion of his argument. In military aviation, there is a concept called a sortie rate. That's the number of individual aircraft missions taking off, dropping their payloads, and returning within a given time frame.
It's its quota system.
Under immense political pressure to maintain a high sortie rate to prove they are winning, the targeting process becomes desperate and sloppy. Commanders are ordered to put steel on target, any target, just to keep the numbers up. The tragic result of treating warfare as an administrative quota system, according to Ritter, is dead school children.
It's a profound critique of the military's operational integrity, rooted entirely in his understanding of how the sausage of targeting is actually made.
Okay, so we have Ritter giving us the microview, the devastating human cost, and the moral bankruptcy of the targeting process. But then we have Larry Johnson, who brings a completely different but equally critical macro lens to the analysis.
Yeah, let's talk about Johnson. His background is rooted in the CIA, in intelligence analysis, in economics, and perhaps most importantly for this specific deep dive, in logistics.
Logistics is key here.
While Ritter is looking at the bomb hitting the target, Johnson is looking at the supply chain that built the bomb, the fuel in the jet, and the raw economic data required to keep the whole machine running.
Johnson's contribution is essential because of an old military adage. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. You can have the most advanced fighter jets in the world, but if you don't have the fuel to fly them or the wrenches to fix them, they are just expensive museum pieces.
They're useless.
Completely. Johnson meticulously tracks exactly how the United States is physically failing to sustain its naval and aerial attack. He points out glaring vulnerabilities in the U.S. supply chain that only someone trained to look at the massive, unsexy macro-logistical picture would ever catch.
Which brings us to what might be the most alarming revelation in this entire analysis, the hidden ammunition crisis. If Johnson's math is correct, The U.S. isn't going to lose this conflict because of a lack of willpower or a lack of advanced technology. They are going to lose because they are quite literally running out of bullets. Let's walk through the naval dilemma that Johnson lays out because it is fascinating and terrifying.
To understand the crisis, we have to look at how the United States projects power in the Middle East. It relies primarily on its naval assets, specifically carrier strike groups like the Abraham Lincoln, which are accompanied by several guided missile destroyers.
The destroyers do the heavy lifting.
They are the workhorses of the fleet. They're armed with what is called a vertical launch system, or VLS. A standard Arleigh Burke-class destroyer has 96 of these VLS slots built into its deck.
Think of them as 96 high-tech silos.
Exactly. These silos house Tomahawk cruise missiles for striking targets deep inland, and Aegis missiles, which are sophisticated interceptors designed to shoot down incoming enemy aircraft and ballistic missiles.
Now, 96 missiles sounds like a lot of firepower. But Johnson identifies a massive, glaring logistical choke point in the design of these ships. Once a destroyer fires those 96 missiles out of its VLS tubes, whether it's firing Tomahawks at Tehran or Aegis missiles to defend against incoming Iranian retaliation, it is entirely out of ammunition.
Okay.
And here is the kicker. They cannot reload these vertical launch tubes while bobbing around in the open ocean.
That is the crucial engineering constraint. The missiles are massive, heavily calibrated pieces of technology. You cannot simply drop them into a tube using a forklift on a rolling deck in 5-foot swells.
It's too dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. Doing so would risk damaging the missile, the ship, or causing a catastrophic explosion. Therefore, to reload those 96 VLS slots, the destroyer physically must sail away from the combat zone to a secure, calm, heavily equipped port facility where massive, specialized shore-based cranes can carefully lower the new ordnance into the ship.
Historically, that wasn't a huge problem. A U.S. ship operating in the Persian Gulf could simply sail a few hours to a friendly nearby port, like the massive Fifth Fleet facility in Bahrain that we talked about earlier, restock in a day or two, and get right back into the fight.
But Johnson connects the dots here. Remember the tactical picture we just painted. The base in Bahrain is currently under active Iranian missile fire. It is not a secure port.
The locals are cheering the missiles.
Right. Furthermore, Johnson states that Iran has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. That's the narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. They are actively threatening any Western military or commercial ship attempting to move through it with a barrage of anti-ship missiles.
So it's a choke point that is actually choked off.
The strategic implication of the Strait of Hormuz closing is that the U.S. Navy is essentially geographically trapped, or at the very least, completely denied access to its usual local resupplied hubs in the Gulf. They cannot use Bahrain, they cannot use facilities in Qatar or the UAE without drawing those nations into a devastating war.
So if they are empty and they can't reload in the Gulf, where do they have to go? This is where Johnson does the brutal logistical math for us. He points out that the nearest safe, fully equipped, American-controlled port capable of reloading those VLS tubes is the U.S. Naval Support Facility at Diego Garcia.
And we need to explain what Diego Garcia is because it's vital to the timeline. Diego Garcia is a militarized atoll located deep in the central Indian Ocean, far south of the Indian subcontinent.
In the middle of nowhere.
It is incredibly remote. It is a strategic bomber base and a naval logistical hub designed precisely for staging massive amounts of fuel and ammunition safely out of the reach of most regional adversaries.
But safety comes at the cost of distance. Johnson calculates that for a destroyer operating near the Gulf of Oman to sail to Diego Garcia, it is a 3.5-day journey, each way.
Think about the sheer mathematical reality of that transit time. 3.5 days steaming south. Assuming the port facilities at Diego Garcia are operating at maximum efficiency and there is no backlog of other ships waiting for the cranes, it takes time to reload 96 tubes.
It's not a pit stop.
Not at all. Then it's 3.5 days steaming back north to the combat zone. That is an absolute minimum of a week. 7 full days that a multi-billion-dollar warship is completely removed from the fight, burning fuel, just trying to get its bullets back.
Therefore, Johnson reaches a devastating conclusion. A sustained, continuous 2047 naval and air campaign against Iran from the southern maritime vector is a physical impossibility.
The math doesn't lie.
The U.S. simply does not have the local infrastructure, the accessible deep-water ports, or the staggering volume of ammunition reserves in theater to maintain the relentless pressure required to force regime change. The math simply does not work.
And this logistical nightmare isn't just a theory constructed by outside analysts looking at maps. Scott Ritter brings up an astonishing claim about deep internal dissent within the Pentagon regarding this exact mathematical reality.
He calls it the revolt of the Joint Chiefs, right?
Yes. According to Ritter, the military planners inside the building knew this logistical math perfectly well. It's literally their job to know it. They knew the VLS constraints, they knew the transit times to Diego Garcia, and they knew they didn't have the required stockpile of munitions to finish what the civilian administration wanted to start.
Ritter gets very specific here. He cites an unnamed United States admiral who allegedly went to his civilian superiors in the administration and frankly stated that the U.S. would lose this conflict.
Not because the sailors weren't brave.
Right, or the tech wasn't good, but purely because they would physically run out of ammunition midway through the war. And what happened to this admiral for providing this brutal, objective, logistical assessment? According to Ritter's source, he was fired.
Fired for doing his job. If true, it paints a picture of an administration that chose to willfully ignore the mathematical reality of its own supply chain, dismiss the expert warnings of its senior logistical commanders, and initiate a massive regional war anyway.
They were betting on a quick psychological collapse of the Iranian government. A collapse that, as we discussed with the failed decapitation strike, just never materialized.
They bet the farm on a bluff.
And the bluff was called. It is genuinely terrifying to realize that modern warfare isn't just about who has the biggest explosions or the most advanced stealth fighters. It is ultimately a giant math problem of supply chains, industrial capacity, and transit times.
And the U.S. is allegedly failing the math across the board. But it's not just on the offensive side. It's on defense as well. Johnson details massive vulnerabilities in the vaunted U.S. and Israeli air defense systems, specifically the Patriot missile system.
The Patriot is like the gold standard, isn't it?
It is the absolute backbone of U.S. and allied air defense in the region. It's designed to protect bases, cities, and critical infrastructure from incoming aircraft and ballistic missiles. But Ritter offers a scathing critique of the system itself.
He calls it snakebit.
A snake-bit system fundamentally derived from 1970s radar and interceptor technology. Sure, it has been upgraded over the decades, but he claims it has never truly worked as flawlessly as advertised in complex combat scenarios.
Because of its inherent technical limitations and the difficulty of hitting a hypersonic or ballistic target midair, standard U.S. military operating procedure dictates that 2 Patriot interceptor missiles must be fired at every single incoming target to ensure a statistical probability of a kill.
2 for 1.
Okay, now let's apply Larry Johnson's logistical math to that operational reality. He states that the total annual production capacity of Patriot missiles in the entire United States industrial base is roughly 700 units.
700 a year.
Right. It takes specialized materials, microchips, and time to build these things. You can't just print them overnight. So imagine a scenario where Iran fires just 50 of its older, cheaper ballistic missiles in a single day. To intercept them, the U.S. must fire 100 Patriot missiles.
The insight here is profound and terrifying. In one single day of average combat, intercepting a relatively small volley of cheap Iranian missiles, the U.S. military burns through roughly 15% of its entire annual production of interceptors.
15% in an afternoon.
The economic and industrial cannibalization is staggering. The U.S. is firing multi-million-dollar interceptors that take years to stockpile at older, vastly cheaper ballistic missiles. Iran doesn't actually have to defeat the U.S. military tactically on the battlefield.
They just have to bankrupt the supply chain.
Exactly. They just have to keep firing until the Patriots run out.
And according to the February 28th broadcasts, we are already seeing the results of this mathematical failure in real time. The sources report that these defensive systems are already buckling under the sheer volume of the attack.
The shield is breaking.
They note that Patriot batteries are failing to prevent Iranian strikes on critical allied bases in Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Furthermore, the heavily publicized Israeli Iron Dome system, which is designed for smaller, shorter-range rockets, has been deeply penetrated by heavier munitions.
The analysts actually note a direct ballistic missile strike occurring in downtown Tel Aviv during the recording of their broadcast. The defensive shield isn't just cracking, it's being actively overwhelmed.
But the failure outlined by Johnson and Ritter isn't strictly tactical or logistical. The way this strike was initiated might actually do more long-term, irreversible damage to the United States than empty launch tubes or damaged bases. We have to examine the diplomatic context of this attack.
The Lucy and the football strategy.
All right, because running out of missiles is a disaster, but destroying your nation's credibility on the global stage is a generational catastrophe. The timing of this military strike is perhaps the most globally damaging aspect of the entire affair.
The analysts point out that this massive, surprise decapitation attack wasn't launched during a breakdown in communications or a period of heightened silence. It was launched right in the middle of active, highly publicized, and supposedly productive peace negotiations.
The deception was elaborate. According to the timeline, in the days immediately preceding the strike, senior Iranian negotiators had been in Geneva, Switzerland. They were sitting across the table, face-to-face, with official U.S. representatives.
Specifically naming Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
Right. They were hashing out terms to de-escalate the regional tensions. And it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just secret backroom talk that nobody knew about. It was public. The diplomatic machinery was in full motion.
The Omani foreign minister, who frequently acts as a neutral mediator in the region, literally tweeted to the world that significant progress had been made in Geneva.
The Iranian foreign minister publicly confirmed that they had resolved several key differences and were actively dispatching technical teams to Vienna to work with the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency. Even the highest levels of the U.S. government were playing along.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly promised he would be traveling to Israel on Monday to continue pushing this diplomatic breakthrough forward.
The stage was perfectly set for a diplomatic resolution. And then, on Saturday morning, the bombs fell. The United States and Israel launched their 50-missile decapitation strike.
Johnson's analogy of the Charlie Brown comic strip is devastatingly apt here. The United States held out the football of diplomatic resolution, Iran ran up to kick it in good faith, and at the absolute last second, the U.S. pulled the football away and launched an assassination attempt.
The geopolitical fallout from this specific, calculated act of deception is catastrophic, and the analysts are very clear about who is watching this unfold: Russia and China. How can any nation, adversary or ally, ever sit across the table and trust the word of the United States ever again?
That is the crux of the diplomatic disaster. This validates the deepest, most paranoid suspicions of America's geopolitical rivals. Johnson points out that Vladimir Putin already operates from a position of deep distrust.
He feels he was burned before.
He feels he was fundamentally deceived by the West regarding the Minsk agreements. Those were the treaties from 2014 and 2015 that were ostensibly designed to halt the fighting in eastern Ukraine, but which Western leaders later admitted were partially used to buy time to arm Kyiv.
So the trust was already gone.
Now, the Kremlin is watching the U.S. explicitly use active high-level peace negotiations in Geneva as a literal smokescreen for a massive surprise attack on a sovereign nation.
The unavoidable conclusion drawn by Moscow and Beijing is that U.S. negotiators like Witkoff and Kushner are not acting as diplomats. They are actors playing a role to lull adversaries into a false sense of security while the bombers get into position.
The bedrock of diplomatic trust is permanently broken.
So if the international community sees this as a blatant deception, how does the U.S. administration justify this to its own people? According to the transcripts, President Trump addressed the nation shortly after the strikes began, and his justification leaned entirely on the specter of nuclear weapons.
The imminent threat argument.
He claimed the attack was absolutely necessary to stop an imminent threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. He painted a picture of a radical dictatorship that was weeks or perhaps days away from threatening the American homeland with a nuclear device.
But the sources we are analyzing vehemently push back on that narrative. They argue that this justification is 100% propaganda, a straight-up manufactured lie designed for domestic consumption.
Ritter points out the glaring, irreconcilable contradiction in the administration's timeline. How can Iran be an imminent rogue nuclear threat when they were, at that exact moment, actively dispatching teams to Vienna to work with the IAEA to get international nuclear inspectors back into their facilities to verify their non-nuclear status?
It doesn't make sense. You don't invite the global nuclear watchdogs into your living room if you are secretly assembling a bomb in the basement.
Exactly. The analysts suggest that the nuclear threat narrative is entirely fabricated to manufacture consent from the American public for a war of regime change that they otherwise would never support.
And this brings us right back to the warning in our introduction. The terrifying reality of modern propaganda, total censorship, and the fog of war. If the government stands at a podium and claims there is an imminent nuclear threat, and the mainstream media amplifies that claim without questioning the logistics, how does the average public discern the truth?
How do they know about the VLS tubes, or the Diego Garcia transit times, or the Geneva peace talks, when the airwaves are flooded with AI-generated imagery and simplistic narratives of good versus evil?
It's an environment perfectly engineered for manipulation. And because the analysts dismiss the nuclear threat as a fabrication, they have to look for the real motivation behind this war. Ritter outlines a deeply cynical but historically common political theory.
Wag the dog.
He suggests that the administration knew its domestic support was crumbling under various internal pressures. They needed a monumental unifying peace through strength victory before the end of March to carry them through the summer news cycle and secure a win in the upcoming midterm elections. They needed a war to rally the base.
According to Ritter, Trump ignored the more cautious, non-interventionist voices in his own orbit, people like Tulsi Gabbard and J.D. Vance.
Or the logistical commanders at the Pentagon who explicitly warned about the ammunition shortage.
Instead, he chose to listen to hardline, hawkish advisors like Lindsey Graham and various advocates who promised that Iran was a house of cards, that the regime would crumble after a few airstrikes, and that it would be a quick, easy, politically highly profitable victory.
They sold him a fantasy, trapping the administration in a sprawling regional war they physically cannot win.
And this is where Ritter's critique becomes incredibly personal, pointed, and angry. He draws a sharp, painful contrast between the people who are actually going to fight and die in this war and the politicians who ordered it from air-conditioned rooms.
He uses the archetype of Billy Joe Bob,
representing the working-class American kids from the Midwest or the South who joined the military out of economic necessity or genuine patriotism. The kids who are now bleeding, dying, and suffocating in burning ships in the Persian Gulf.
He contrasts that profound sacrifice with the life of Donald Trump's own son, Barron,
whom Ritter describes as a member of the protected elite, safely sequestered away at a prestigious university, completely shielded from the gruesome physical consequences of his father's geopolitical gambles. It is a furious, searing indictment of the massive class divide inherent in how America wages its wars.
It's a heavy accusation, and it really grounds the geopolitical theory in human reality. But while the human cost is being paid by the military, the economic consequences of this miscalculation are going to hit every single person on the planet.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most globally destabilizing section of our deep dive, the economic shockwaves and the brink of World War III.
The economic realities detailed by Larry Johnson are immediate, mathematical, and terrifying. We've already established the tactical reality that the Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to Western commercial and military shipping. We need to underscore what that actually means.
It's not just a river.
It is one of the most vital, irreplaceable global arteries for energy transport. Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that narrow choke point. Because of this sudden, violent closure, Johnson predicts the global energy markets are going to enter a state of sheer panic.
He forecasts that oil prices are going to skyrocket almost instantly, potentially hitting $120 a barrel for Brent crude in the immediate future, with no ceiling in sight if the conflict drags on.
And we all know what $120 oil does to a global economy that relies on just-in-time shipping.
It causes rampant inflation, it spikes the cost of food delivery, it halts manufacturing. But Johnson notes an interesting geopolitical wrinkle here. It seems some countries saw this exact scenario coming.
They read the tea leaves.
He points out that China, perhaps possessing superior intelligence gathering, or simply reading the geopolitical landscape better than the West, spent the last 4 weeks quietly, aggressively hoarding oil on the global market, topping off their strategic reserves. They insulated themselves.
But countries like Japan and Indonesia, whose economies rely entirely on uninterrupted, continuous energy shipments through the Gulf, are left incredibly vulnerable to this sudden, massive shock. Their economies could face rolling blackouts within weeks.
But the global economic crisis is merely the first domino. The regional military explosion is what threatens to physically rewrite the map of the Middle East. The sources report a monumental escalation. Saudi Arabia has reportedly declared war on Iran in response to the chaos.
This is no longer just a U.S. and Israeli operation. It is a full-blown Sunni-Shia regional conflict. And remember Iran's explicit warning. Any Arab state hosting U.S. bases or radar systems is considered actively complicit and will be targeted.
Right, and Iran isn't just threatening to lob a few missiles at empty runways in the desert. They understand the economic leverage they hold. They have explicitly threatened to use their vast missile arsenal to systematically wipe out the critical multi-billion-dollar oil infrastructure of the Gulf nations.
The refineries, the pipelines, the loading terminals.
Exactly, if their own facilities are attacked. Johnson bluntly states that if the West and its allies push too hard, Iran will simply light up the entire Persian Gulf. They have the capability to potentially knock out 25% of the world's petroleum supply overnight. The global economy wouldn't just slow down, it would grind to an absolute catastrophic halt.
This impending economic and logistical doom raises the ultimate chilling question of this entire analysis. What happens when Israel and the United States finally realize the math is against them?
What happens when they accept that they cannot win a conventional war of attrition because their VLS tubes are empty, their Patriot missiles are depleted, and their economies are imploding?
This is the darkest conclusion reached by both Johnson and Ritter. Johnson argues that within a matter of weeks, an increasingly desperate Israel, facing sustained, daily, highly destructive bombardment from Iranian missiles and suffering from critically depleted air defenses, will have their back against the wall.
They will plead with the United States for extreme, unconventional intervention.
And that extreme intervention, according to the sources, is the unthinkable. Johnson posits that a desperate Israeli leadership, or perhaps even a politically cornered U.S. administration desperate to save face, might resort to crossing the ultimate red line.
Using a tactical nuclear weapon.
Using a tactical nuclear weapon against a hardened Iranian missile site or a leadership bunker in a last-ditch, catastrophic effort to stop the barrage and force a surrender.
But the analysts warn that if that nuclear threshold is crossed, the conflict instantly ceases to be a contained regional Middle Eastern war. It becomes a global cataclysm.
If a nuclear weapon is detonated in Iran, the analysts predict that Russia and China, who have thus far remained somewhat quietly supportive of Iran, providing intelligence, diplomatic cover, and backdoor supply chains, will be forced by their own strategic imperatives to step out of the shadows.
They cannot allow the precedent of Western nuclear first use against an ally to stand unanswered.
And just to ensure maximum anxiety, Johnson drops one final, terrifying wildcard onto the table: North Korea.
People forget that North Korea already possesses a functioning arsenal of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, and they have incredibly strong, long-standing military and technological ties to Iran. They've shared missile tech for decades.
Johnson suggests that if Iran is threatened with literal nuclear annihilation, North Korea could actively come to their aid, either by providing advanced weaponry or by opening a second nuclear front in Asia to distract the United States.
We are talking about plunging the entire planet into a multipolar, utterly unpredictable nuclear standoff.
To summarize this staggering geopolitical shift, Larry Johnson uses a very poignant, incredibly effective analogy. He compares the United States to an aging, overweight, former heavyweight boxing champion.
The champion is still coasting on his reputation from victories decades ago, but he has grown arrogant, slow, and out of shape.
He compares Iran to a skinny, underestimated kid from the streets. The U.S. stepped into the ring expecting a quick, easy first-round knockout. But the skinny kid didn't go down. He absorbed the blow, and he survived 3 grueling rounds.
And the profound insight here is that simply by surviving, by exposing the aging champion's lack of stamina, his empty punches, and his dwindling power, the kid has earned the respect of the entire world.
The U.S. hasn't just failed to defeat Iran. In the process of failing, it has exposed its own fundamental logistical weakness on the global stage for every adversary to see.
That analogy perfectly captures the gravity of what we've discussed today. We have covered a massive, intimidating amount of ground. We are looking at sources detailing the spectacular failure of a decapitation strike against the highest echelons of Iranian leadership.
A military paralyzed by a hidden logistical nightmare.
Staring down empty missile tubes and forced into a week-long, humiliating resupply transit to Diego Garcia just to stay in the fight. We are looking at a catastrophic betrayal of diplomatic trust in Geneva that has permanently alienated major world powers like Russia and China.
And most terrifyingly, the looming, very real shadow of a nuclear escalation as conventional defensive systems buckle under the sheer mathematical strain of a multi-front war.
And this brings us back to why this specific type of deep dive is so immensely valuable. In a world saturated with heavily curated news feeds, AI-generated propaganda masquerading as truth, and simplistic political narratives designed to keep you angry and distracted, looking at the raw, unvarnished logistical realities is the only way to find the truth.
Understanding exactly how a vertical launch system works, or why a destroyer takes 3.5 days to sail to Diego Garcia, offers a much clearer, more honest, and far more predictive picture of global stability than a sanitized press briefing ever could.
It strips away the emotional rhetoric, ignores the deepfakes, and leaves us with the cold, hard, unavoidable math of modern warfare. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you process everything we've unpacked today. The sources strongly argue that sheer military hubris, political desperation, and an over-reliance on past glories blinded the planners to the reality of their own dwindling ammunition and broken supply chains. They started a war without checking the inventory.
A fatal error.
It makes you wonder if a global superpower's ultimate vulnerability isn't the technological strength of its enemy, but a simple, arrogant failure to count its own bullets before throwing the first punch. How many other global strategies, massive economic systems, or supposedly ironclad political alliances are currently resting on a massive hollow bluff that the rest of the world is finally ready to call?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.